Hello everyone, my name is Carsten Puhl, I'm the CTO and one of the managing directors at Hubject, and I have been kindly invited by Solid Studio to give a presentation on the future of eRoaming today. And of course that is a request that I will happily follow, but before doing so, let me use the opportunity and thank Solid Studio for giving me the possibility to talk about the subject that has been at the center of my daily work for the last 5 years. Now, before we look at the future of eRoaming, let's have a short look at its current state, right? So what is eRoaming, especially central eRoaming, offering today? It is offering I would say, basic line of functions that are needed uniformly across the market by certain market participants, mainly charge point operators and e-mobility service providers, and to a limited extent by a few others. And what functions are we talking about? We're talking about the transmission of data, mainly location data, session data, billing relevant data in the form of so-called charge data records. We're talking about authorization services so that e-mobility service providers can initiate charging sessions at the infrastructure of charge point operators, and we're talking about some form of contract management, right? For Hubject, the contract management comes in the form of a graphical user interface on the internet that can be used by charge point operators to issue their contractual offers, and for e-mobility service providers to either accept or decline these offers and ask for bilateral offers and stuff like that, right? And now, as you can see, these functions, they are so generic that they do not even constitute services by themselves, right? They are merely the basis so that EMPs and CPOs can build their own services on top of them, right? They do not really give you an edge over your competition, right? They do not allow to form a USP, and that brings us to the core of the problem. They are always in danger of becoming commoditized, which means their felt value, their perceived value will drop over time. And as a consequence, their price will drop over time. So they're a bit like soap, right? Super helpful for your hygiene, but usually dead cheap to get. And you know, you need soap anyway these days. If there's shower gels around, all kinds of fancy shower gels that give you super smooth skin, that make you basically irresistible and less sweaty for the next 24 hours or so. And you know, it's a bit the same with eRoaming, isn't it? I sometimes have the feeling that everyone sees the value in central eRoaming and at the same time wants to get rid of it and replace it by something else, right? Be it bilateral connections or P2P connections or fancy blockchain constructs or credit card readers. So that raises the question, what can eRoaming hubs actually do to stay relevant in the future, right? And what I want to do is I want to show possibility. I'm not saying that the operator of eRoaming hubs must do all of them or implement all of them or any of them. I just want to show viable options, which brings me to the most obvious one. And I really don't want to talk much about it, value-added services, right? Now, without a shred of a doubt, adding more services to the current portfolio that are needed by most market participants, that would add value also to the basic eRoaming, right? I don't have any doubt about it. Because also these services would make sense in the context of aggregation. What could these services be? So, you know, it could be financial services, billing, payment, price calculation, invoice creation, money remittance, even giving credit and stuff like that, right? eRoaming hubs could become large booking platforms that allow for the pre-booking and reservation of charge points, and they could introduce quality assuring measures that aim at data correction and enrichment, because as we all know, the data quality in the market is actually rather low. And there are many more of these services, but I don't really want to go into details here, mainly for two reasons. First of all, all of these topics have a strong business focus, and secondly, these are all new services, right? That basically are complementary services, but they have very little to do with what eRoaming hubs are actually offering today, and I would really like to drive this presentation into a slightly different direction. Which brings me to my first point, and yeah, it's getting a little bit dry now, and that's the point of governance. So when I was talking about the basic functions that eRoaming hubs are offering today, I left one very important one out, and that's the one of governance. Now, today what we see in the market is very little official regulation when it comes to the question how companies in e-mobility should do business with each other, right? And I'm sure that also official regulation will increase on that part over time, but it will only go so far, right? I fail to see that official regulation will flesh out the minute details. But in a deeply interconnected market, where the very existence of some market participants depends on the services of many others, clear rules and regulations are a must. Now you could argue that rules are mainly a verbal construct, right? I do not need a technical eRoaming platform to do that for me. I could argue that what you need is an association or a group of like-minded people that just sits down together, writes down these rules and puts them to paper, right? And that's true. Well, keep in mind we're talking about non-official regulation here, right? So, and if you look at e-mobility today, the market is dominated by de facto standards, but not by official ones. And that raises the question, how can I actually enforce these rules, right, if they are not official? And that's where having a handle on the technological layer is actually coming in quite handy, because eRoaming hubs, eRoaming platforms, they can enforce rules on their platforms. They can enforce by the book implementation of their protocols, and they can force customers to switch to a next higher protocol version, and they can discontinue old versions, and they can demand certain security measures when partners are connecting to their platforms, as they can forbid certain contractual clauses, right? Because usually these contractual clauses have some kind of digital representation on the eRoaming platform. And moreover, and I think this is also a very important part, eRoaming hubs do not only represent themselves, right? They represent whole groups on the platform. They represent the interests of all CPOs on the platform and of all EMPs on the platform, and that gives them some leverage and some weight. And I can totally understand how some market participants might be skeptical to such a policing force, but you know, I really don't like to think of eRoaming hubs as the police of e-mobility. I like to think of them as libraries, you know. If you go into a library, there are certain rules and regulations that you have to follow. You need to be calm and silent, and you have to put the book back where you took it from. But on the other hand, it's also much easier to find a book in a library, and there are usually people that help you with your search. So in my opinion, eRoaming hubs must enact that role as governing authorities in e-mobility much more in the future than they did in the past. They must create clear rules where official regulation leaves gaps, and they must enforce these rules across their networks. The next point is of course very much connected to the last one. I'm just going to put that one down. Security, right? Now, what's getting all the attention today in terms of security is really the hardware part of e-mobility. It's basically all about the security of charging infrastructure, of cores, of credit card terminals and such. And there's a reason for that, because official regulation puts a great focus on the end consumer today in an attempt to establish e-mobility as an accepted mass technology. And that makes perfect sense, right? Because you first have to win the trust of the end consumer. You must show the end consumer how safe and secure e-mobility actually is, EV charging actually is. That's absolutely understandable, right? And you know, that's why we hear a lot about the insecurity of RFID cards, right? Everyone knows about that, and why there's a lot of emphasis on data protection and data privacy. And rightfully so. What worries me a little bit is that there is another layer of technology, right? That's getting a lot less attention. And that's the vast amount of machine-to-machine communication that's going on in e-mobility, right? This is a network that we're forming here. The vast amount of data that's shared across the different systems in the network, and also the vast amount of automated interaction that's going on between these systems, right? I mean, anyone else here getting the feeling that this might become a problem in an ecosystem that does not know any kind of enforced security standards? Luckily for us all, most of the incidents that we see today in e-mobility originate from human or machine error. But I'm also certain that will change in the future, and that we will see many more incidents that can be traced back to malicious intent. And that's where the trouble begins, right? Because the longer we wait to establish reliable security standards in e-mobility, the harder it will get. And I totally understand that today, e-mobility infrastructure, the e-mobility ecosystem, well, it's not, not terribly important for the whole of society, but at some point it will be. At some point, we will be talking critical infrastructure here. At some point, that infrastructure will be so important that it must always be available, and it will be so important that it must never be compromised, right? And, that's the thing, right? In its current state, the network is extremely vulnerable, because in a network, it's not only your security that counts, because that's what everyone is focused at the moment on, right? Your own security. But in a network, it's also the security of others that matters. A hacker does not have to get access to your system, they just have to get access to a system in a network to cause chaos and havoc. And I think that could also be a very valuable role for eRoaming to take on, to become basically security authorities. They could start, and again, these are just examples, right? They could start auditing their partners to make sure that their technology, but also their organization, meet a certain minimum standard for a secure ecosystem. They could serve as proxies for their partners and shield them from unnecessary traffic and malicious attacks. And they could introduce a lot more fraud detection, fraud prevention, and anti-data tampering mechanisms, so their partners have to do it to a lesser extent. I think these could be valuable services. Now let's get to another very important point, and that's the one of data analysis or analytical data. I mean, obviously, eRoaming hubs aggregate quite a bit of data today, right? And what mostly catches our attention is the data that's exchanged between the partners on such a platform. And we talked about that: location data, session data, billing relevant data in the form of CDRs. But more than that, eRoaming hubs are also gathering a lot of so-called traffic data that is actually created when two systems are communicating with each other. And that's, mostly neglected nowadays, right? It's used sometimes in selected projects, but in my opinion, that data could actually be processed and transformed into analytical data that might be quite valuable for many market participants and beyond, right? Because if you think about it, even a mobility service provider and charge point operators, and these are roles that are deeply ingrained into the e-mobility ecosystem, they have mostly access to their own data, of course, and the data that is shared with them. What they do not have is access to huge pools of aggregated traffic data. Let me give you an example that makes it a little bit more digestible what I'm talking about. If you are a e-mobility service provider, right, then you know exactly how many of your own authorization attempts are failing at a certain charge point. What you do not know is how many authorization attempts of other EMPs are failing at the same charge point, right? Now imagine there was a service, maybe coming from a eRoaming hub, that tells you exactly that. How many of all transactions of all EMPs across a whole platform are failing at a certain charge point. At an EMP, I could, as an EMP, I could do quite a bit with that information. I could evaluate my own implementation, because it's not always the charge point that has a problem. It could also be my system that actually has a problem. Maybe my timeouts are too short or whatever, right? And if you think about another application, what I could also do with that, I could, for example, hide certain charge points in my mobile consumer app, right? To keep my customers from driving to charge points that have a very low overall success rate. And this is a super simple example, right? But still helpful. If you think about more complex applications, what comes to mind are finding and predicting patterns of user behavior, or establishing a certain comparability between entities in specific groups or data clusters. So answering the question, how well am I as a provider of e-mobility services, am I doing in comparison to others that provide similar or same services? How reliable is my system in comparison to other systems in the market? Or how correct and complete is my data in comparison to the data of others? And again, I think this could be interesting services. Now, my last point I termed inclusivity, reducing complexity. That's a bit of a difficult one. Now, at the very core of what eRoaming hubs are offering is the idea to create a cooperative landscape in which e-mobility can thrive, right? And in the past, eRoaming has always been the answer to a very fragmented e-mobility landscape. But what we can see, or what we could see in the past few years, that on a technological level, complexity has actually increased, right? And ironically, also due to eRoaming. And that's because today there is not just one eRoaming hub, but there are several eRoaming hubs. And there's not just one communication protocol in a market, there are several communication protocols in a market, right? You have the OICP, you have the OCPI, you have the OCHP, and you have the EMIP, and you have several others, right? And to make matters even worse, some of these, or all of these protocols, they do not have just one version in the market, but there are several versions in the market. And to make matters even worse, some of these protocols also have derivatives, where basically market participants made changes to these protocols and therefore created new versions. Yeah, I mean, this is of course a problem, right? And it seems like this trend will continue, because now there are new entities entering the market that want to get access to the same data, but in different ways. Just think about the national access points, for example, right? The German Leitstelle Elektromobilität, they want to have access to mostly location data, but they have their own data format, which is called DATEX2, right? And they come with their own API to consume that data. And the French Advenir program, they want to have access to session data, and they also have their own API to consume that data in their own format, right? So in my opinion, what eRoaming hubs could do is they could take interoperability to the next level, right? Because as long as we have multiple hubs, multiple protocols, multiple versions of these protocols, and derivatives in the market, translation services between these protocols will be needed. But, to be honest, for e-mobility service providers and charge point operators, there is very little value to be found in these translation services, because they cannot really commercialize these services towards their end consumers or clients, right? For them, it's just a complex necessity that has to be solved by someone, and in my opinion, that someone could be eRoaming hubs. This is, by the way, one of the areas where Solid Studio and Hubject are strongly cooperating. Yeah? And Solid Studio's intensive knowledge of all the protocols in the market is helping us a lot in our endeavors here. So thank you again, Solid. I don't know where they are, but thank you again. Which brings me to the conclusion of this presentation, finally. Yay. I do not have any idea how the future of eRoaming will look like. Well, I have an idea, but you know, I don't really know, and I think no one really does. Because it depends on so many factors, and I think ultimately it also depends a bit on what the market really wants, right? Where the market wants to go. What I wanted to show with this presentation is that eRoaming hubs, central eRoaming, might offer value that is not quite as apparent. If you go beyond the obvious, if you go beyond value-added services, you know, you might find old roles and responsibilities that could be strengthened. You can find new roles and responsibility that eRoaming hubs could take on, and you will find new services that they can offer. And yes, these services, as I have shown, they will not always be very sexy, and they will not make a big bang, but they will still be crucial and essential to the industry. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, happy to take them.